Hey, everybody, and welcome to this special conversation we're going to have after that fabulous film. And oh my goodness, I absolutely love that movie. It's so good. We're going to get into all that. I want to introduce you guys, but first I should say who I am. My name is Lisa Dickey, and I am an author and a book collaborator based in Los Angeles, but I have spent a lot of time in Russia. And in fact, Ambassador Tracy, who is with us tonight, she and I started out together, actually, it turns out, in Moscow in the late 1980s, working at the U.S. Embassy there. So that was back in the Sovietsky Soyuz days, but we were there, and it was a pretty amazing time, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that from Ambassador Tracy. So I want to just intro Ambassador Tracy and Anne DeMare, the filmmaker, give you a little bit of background about them. Lynne Tracy was sworn in as ambassador to the Russian Federation on January 9th, 2023. She is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service and has most recently served as ambassador to the Republic of Armenia, as a senior advisor for Russia affairs in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, and as deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, Russia. So she's got a depth of experience in Moscow for sure. Her other foreign service assignments include Turkmenistan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, and various positions in much less exotic Washington, D.C. Ambassador Tracy is the recipient of the Secretary of State's Award for Heroism and the Distinguished Honor Award. She earned a bachelor's degree in Soviet Studies from the University of Georgia, the state, not the country, and a JD from the University of Akron. Ambassador Tracy is a native of Barberton, Ohio. And I hope we're going to hear a lot about all of this. But first, let me also introduce Anne DeMare, documentary filmmaker. Anne is an Emmy award-winning documentary filmmaker and a recipient of both a MacArthur Foundation Media and Journalism grant and a Carnegie Corporation of New York Democracy Program grant. Her feature films as a director and producer include The Home Stretch, which aired on Public Broadcasting System's Independent Lens, Capturing the Flag, and Asparagus, Stalking the American Life, which is a fabulous title and I'm sure an equally fabulous film. She was a co-producer on Deej, D-E-E-J, Deej. Not sure what that is, but hopefully we'll hear about that too. Anne's work has been supported by Sundance Institute, Chicken and Egg Pictures, the Chicago Media Project, Good Pitch, Now Doc Society, and many more. She directed and produced the Real Rosie the Riveter Project, a filmed archive of World War II women munitions workers for New York University libraries. She also directed the film you just saw, The Girl with the Rivet Gun, an award-winning animated documentary short, which we all just saw. And just before we start, I just wanted to, I think I told you this yesterday, but my grandmother was actually a Rosie the Riveter. And there she is, and her sister. And they were both Rosie the Riveters during the Second World War. And actually, there was a woman in your film who really reminds me of my grandmother. So, but I would love to just hear about the film, how it came about. Oh, and by the way, before that, this is all obviously in conjunction. It's all about International Women's Day, which the theme this year is Embrace Equity, which we're going to talk about, and obviously which was addressed in the film. And we would like all of you to please send in questions, because I'm going to ask some questions of the ambassador and Anne, and then in the end, they will be taking questions from you. So, all right, so let's start out. Rosie the Riveters, how did all of this come about? How many people did you talk to?
Yeah, it's a long story. I'll try to keep it a little bit brief, actually. And I also just want to say thank you all for having me and the film. It's a very special project for me, and speaks to really the stories that we listen to and the stories that we don't listen to, the stories that kind of get caught up in history. The way the film came about was that I was working actually on a piece of musical theater. In my previous life, before I was a filmmaker, I worked in theater. And I was working, helping someone write the book, a wonderful playwright named Elizabeth Hemmerdinger, who you saw her name also in the credits of the film. We were working on a musical about Rosie the Riveter. And every time we talked about it, someone would say, as you just did, Lisa, my grandma was a Rosie, my next door neighbor was a Rosie. And we started to feel like at that point, this was in the early 2000s, that these women were sort of slipping through our fingers because the generation was beginning to pass. And we got together with a marvelous historian named Michael Nash at New York University Libraries. They have a beautiful labor archive there, fantastic archive of labor history in the United States. And we started interviewing women and recording them on camera. And we interviewed a total of 48 women for the project. And as we were talking to them, what blew us away was we had never heard these stories. There were so many stories, because the whole population moved during that war. There was so much cultural movement, societal movement, and we were hearing these incredible stories, many of which you just heard, and some more of which I will share, I'm sure. But that's how the film started, because then we had all these interviews and we're like, what do we do with these? They're amazing. But all we really had were sort of talking heads of older women who had wonderful stories, but many of whom were not necessarily the best storytellers at the age of 90, 95. You would get their stories after listening to them for an hour or so. And we wanted to find a way to bring them to life. And we struck on the idea of animation. And that's how it all began. It was a very long-winded answer, but that's how it began. It was really a desire to share the memories of these women and their stories in a way that would really reach people and reach people across generations.
I think one of the things that is interesting and speaks directly to what we're talking about with our current International Women's Day theme is the women talking about doing the same jobs as the guys and getting paid 45 cents an hour, and the guys get paid 75 cents an hour.
Yes.
And it occurred to me, the Second World War was 80 years ago now. And, that was happening then, but it's still kind of happening now. So we still, as much progress as has been made, we still have our work cut out for us. I'm curious as to whether the women spoke to that at all, or did they feel like, they had done what they could do? I'm curious about that.
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, you have to remember that what happened with the Rosies entering the workforce. First of all, women always worked. A lot of the mythology is that, women entered the workforce. They always worked, but they worked in very specific jobs. They worked in laundries and kitchens and other people's homes. They were not part of the industrial universe up until that time. And they were never paid enough money to live. When the war broke out and the government started recruiting women to work because they didn't have enough of a workforce, it was the first time ever that women in this country anyway earned anything close to a living wage. They got paid less than the men, but the labor unions were really terrified that if the women were paid a lot less, what they were used to earning, that then when the men came back from the war, the jobs wouldn't be there to pay them as much. So it was this window in time where women actually earned more money than they had ever earned before. And even though the pay scale was so different, all of the women that we talked a period of time, they were earning money like they'd never earned before, and that they didn't earn that much money after the war. So it was this window. And they talked about how far we still needed to go. And as an aside, one of the first audiences that I shared this with, I have 3 young nephews who are in their 20s. And they all said, well, it's exactly the same now, like how much things change and how much they remain the same with the equity issues, but also with the sort of racial tensions and the other things that are spoken about in the film. Like we're still fighting the same demons in our society.
Yeah. Well, I thought that was a particularly powerful moment of the women talking about banding together in ways that they never expected. So the woman who was from the South realizes, this Northerner, this Yankee, as she called her, is not so bad. And the woman, who the African-American woman who comes in and it's, shocker, this Rosie the Riveter is not white. She's actually a Black woman. And so realizing, I think, that in banding together, they had a lot more power than if they were factionalized themselves. And actually, I would be curious, Ambassador Tracy, to ask you sort of what your feelings are about that in terms of just where are we now in terms of women being able to band together as opposed to having these factions?
Well, thank you, Lisa. And I really want to say how much I enjoyed the film, first of all, and it resonated with me as the granddaughter of um, grandparents who were young families at the time, and seeing some of what was happening with women in the workforce and the impact that it made in their thinking about education for women. Because they saw women who, with some training or with opportunity, were able to take care of themselves. And I know that for my grandparents, it really strengthened their determination that my mother needed an education. She needed to be able to take care of herself. And, listening to women talking there about having the money, having more money than anyone else in their family, and how much that mattered. I mean, not just for their own well-being, but they were able to contribute to the family. But coming to your question, Lisa, I think, in fact, I was also watching that scene in the animation of when the women are having the break together and talking and enjoying each other's company. Also, that story about two people coming from different cultures and needing to rely on each other. I think we see that very much, I will say, in the work culture that I'm in. When I look around and think about what has contributed to my success, it has been having networks of support. And one of the most important networks of support that I have had throughout my career, and especially now as a leader, is a network of other women, peers who are in similar positions, who I've been able to depend on. But also, I want to also give credit to men who have made sure that they have supported women and their advancement in certainly in the State Department as an institution, and for looking for future leaders. But when I think about day to day, as I said, one of my most important networks really is the network of women who've been through similar experiences, who you can go to and say, "Are you also experiencing this problem?" Yeah. There was nothing more, I think, and the thing that probably made me the most indignant even now was that episode of the Rosie who was told, "Yeah, you can just go leave the workplace, go find your money somewhere else."
I'm curious, Ambassador, is there a formalized group of women within the State Department, or is that just sort of an informally women specifically look out for each other?
It's a combination. We do have some formal groups. There's an executive women's leadership group. But I would say that there are probably more informal networks that develop right from the very beginning. Usually, and we're encouraged to think about these networks and developing them, partly because we're moving around all the time. And so needing to constantly be able to find ways to stay in touch, because you're in the Foreign Service, where you're moving every 2 and 3 years, it's not static. And so we're really encouraged to constantly be looking at building networks. And a lot of them do tend to be informal. But just for instance, before coming to Russia, I was in an ambassadorial seminar where I think 50% of our seminar were women, and of similar backgrounds and experiences. And I can tell you, even since I've arrived here, I've been in touch with them.
That's great. And there was a great statistic of 194 U.S. ambassadors today, 83 are women, which clearly that's a lot more than I expected. I did not expect the number to be that high. So obviously something is going right here.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're definitely, I think we're doing a lot better in terms of women in leadership positions. I think where we need to work harder, the numbers are not as good when it comes to people of color, women of color, there our numbers are have been really stagnant. And I think I really give Secretary Blinken at the State Department credit, and because he is very focused on this issue, because the way our system works, when people come in to the Foreign Service, they move along over years and build their experience. They move into higher leadership positions, but we don't allow for lateral entries as much. And so, what our future leadership will look like in 20 years is based on what it looks like right now in terms of our intake. So it's really important, I think, that we are focused on these issues of equity because we're setting the stage for what our future leadership will look like.
Yep, that's such a great point, because really it's everybody moving up the ranks now is starting now. So it really will affect everything in the future. You told me an incredible fact yesterday that I didn't know, that into the 1970s, women who were in the Foreign Service would have to quit if they became married. Wow.
That's right. And that's what, for me, when I thought about and was watching this film, was you have these moments that do propel women because of social upheaval, major, war, other things that force some significant change. But then what you realize is there's a lot of change that only happens more incrementally. And it took from World War II until 1971 to get, in this case, the State Department to recognize that we were, doing ourselves a disservice. We were separating ourselves from talent by forcing women out simply because they got married. Whereas, of course, the men were able to, to stay in.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary fact. I was not aware of that. I want to push back a little farther back in time. There's an interesting corollary, it seems, between Russian women earlier in the 20th century who were fighting for rights and American suffragists. And it seems like there was a sort of a bonding that happened among women who were really just fighting for the most basic of rights. And do you have any sort of insights into that?
Well, I think that women's stories are, in a sense, more universal than men's in some ways, because women are all across cultures. Women fight the same battles, and we know we fight the same battles. I think it's interesting that, something that Ambassador Tracy said I thought was so interesting about your parents and your grandparents, because it was the children of the Rosies, of the generation of Rosies, who were the first women who really entered college at a huge rate. And they're the ones who started the second women's movement in America in the 60s and 70s. They're the ones who pushed for the Equal Rights Amendment, which we know where that is, but where we really, it was that generation of women who were more educated to take that on. And I think that when you're talking about like the cross-cultural parallels between women in the Soviet Union and women in America, I think that you have to remember that women having the vote happened. There's women alive now, a few of them, who didn't have the vote in this country. It's so recent. It was 20 years before the Second World War that women didn't have even the right to vote. And so it's hard to imagine, I think, for young people now, how much change and cultural change happens over generations. As Ambassador was saying, like, it's not a fast fix. You need things to work through a generation to come out the other end. And we need to be impatient, but we also need to understand the wheels of time, because it's the long game that matters,
Yeah, I guess sometimes just the game seems longer than we want it to seem.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Ambassador Tracy, I'm curious, with your long history of being in Russia and spending in time in Russia, going back to the Soviet Union era, I'm wondering what you have seen in terms of how things have changed for women there, what your takeaways have been, and what, if anything, you've learned from seeing the experience of Russian and Soviet women.
Well, first, just an observation, and we may have questions or comments from our audience on this topic. But of course, there was tremendous sacrifice here in the Soviet Union during World War II. And women, much like the Rosies in the United States, were engaging in also the kind of work that we were seeing in the film to support the war effort here. And they were just a necessary part of the success ultimately at the end of World War II. So, what, the first time that I came to the Soviet Union, or I shouldn't say the first time, but I was here at the embassy in the late 1980s. This is, Lisa, when you and I crossed paths, so to speak. And what I remember from that time was still a sense, women were working, but because of the economic system, it was hard to see where women were able to stand out and take advantage of their talent to really, because there wasn't private property or private industry. There were other ways in which women could excel and did excel. But, and it's at least one way that we often look at in the private sector, that was harder to see. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because when I came back to Russia in 2014 as the deputy, wow, we had all these women who were running businesses, leading in think tanks and NGOs. And to me, that difference from when I left in 1990 and what I saw in 2014 was really noticeable. I've only been here 2 months, so I haven't been able to kind of reassess now where things stand. But I've only been gone 5.5 years, but just that really big shift from the the time of when the Soviet Union broke up and Russia embarked on its path to 2014, I saw women really advance.
Yeah, it's incredible how much things change over time, given just changes socially, changes politically, changes in everything that's going on in a country will have that effect. And I wanted to just bounce it back to you for a second, because we talked a little bit yesterday and you told me a couple of other stories of some of the women that didn't make it in. And I was wondering if you could share some of those, because I think there's some really fascinating nuggets in there.
There were so many stories we wish we could have told. I'll tell two, actually. So one was, there was a wonderful woman whose name was Shirley Clark, who grew up in Chicago and ended up going to Detroit during the war. And she was very smart, and she had a very mathematical mind. And she was hired by the Chrysler Corporation in what she thought was the accounting department. It turns out that the day after the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, her whole department was called in, and they were each given a little pin, and she still had it, a little brass pin with the letter A on it. And they were told that the calculations that they were working on had helped to create the atomic bomb. And when I met Shirley Clark, she was 92 years old. And that was the moral and ethical dilemma of her entire life, that she had been a part of the making of that weapon. And what struck me, and she's the loveliest woman, gentle soul, really beautiful, gentle soul. And it really made me think about how everyday people can get caught up in history in ways that are really unexpected, and how, when there is a heightened social or political moment, everyday people are called in to play roles that they never chose and never would have taken otherwise, and how interconnected we all really are. And that was a really powerful story. There was another story, a woman who lived in Baltimore, who had the best first name ever. Her first name was Adelia. And she grew up in a very violent home. Her father was extremely violent. and very controlling and abusive. And she was a young woman when the war broke out. So she wasn't a teenager, she was in her early 20s. And she explained that she had often tried to go out, she would get a job so she could get the money to leave home. And she talked about working in a bank and working in like a market. And her father would always go down and get her fired. Basically go down to wherever she worked and was like, she's my daughter, she's coming home. Well, when the war broke out, she marched right down and she signed up because you couldn't get fired from a war contract. So it was, you couldn't, once you signed, that was it. Like her father couldn't get her fired. And it was her way out of this sort of, you talk generational abuse that was happening in her home. And so I just thought that was amazing that it empowered her, the war empowered her to be able to leave home and get out of a situation where as a young woman, she had no rights and she had no agency to be able to, to make her life better. And so those were just two of the many stories that we heard. And I just want to say that one of the things that was extraordinary about this whole project was understanding that carving space to listen to older women tell their stories. You realize that we as a society, we don't listen to older women. And there was this feeling like we were carving this very almost sacred space to listen to these stories. And it was a beautiful project to work on for that reason. We felt really fortunate to interview these women sort of towards the end of their life and to get their stories. So
yeah. And I think one of the things that's really interesting to me is that a thread that comes through all of these stories is it does require some courage on the part of these women to do things that women have never or traditionally not done in their society, right? So they put on pants to go into the factory. They're running these machines like the guys do. I love the quote from the woman who says, "They pushed my hell diver into the ocean," and how heartbroken she was that her plane got pushed into the ocean. And just how probably when she was a little girl at the turn of the century, she never imagined, or in the 20s or whatever, she never imagined that this would be, what her life would be. And I think for women, advancement does often depend upon taking opportunity where you see it, but you have to have the courage to do that. And on the question of courage, I do kind of want to ask about your heroism award, if I may, Ambassador Tracy. I'm very curious about that.
So I was in Peshawar, Pakistan, as the principal officer. This was 2008. It was the end of my second of three, what was a 3-year assignment there. And the hunt for bin Laden was on, and the security environment had become increasingly difficult in Peshawar and in the general area. And so what happened was that on the way to work one day, my vehicle was ambushed. I give all the credit to my driver, who was just, nerves of steel under the kind of unimaginable pressure. I mean, we were forced to stop. Gunmen jumped out, opened fire on the car. We backed up. He got us out safely. But the rest of the story was after that morning, after, I was interviewed by the police, I insisted on going back to work because I knew that there would be a lot of rumors and worries, and, people sometimes need to see and know that everything is okay. And I had learned a lot from other leaders, mentors, women and men, about the importance of just being calm under pressure and showing that example. And so that was part of, I wrote the report about what happened that day because, I'd been in the middle of it. There was nobody else that could could explain what had happened. But then the other part of the award was really because I did stay. I felt it was important to show an example. We were encouraging local leaders not to leave because they were also being attacked by terrorists. And so I felt that the example of staying and being there in solidarity was a very important one at the time. And so that's what the award was about.
I mean, you know, when you hear a story like that and you think like, you know, you are a person who just a couple decades earlier would have been asked to leave the service if you had gotten married, because God forbid. I mean, and also, you know, to be in a position that you were in a place like Peshawar, Pakistan, which is a you know, I don't think necessarily, you know, being a woman in a position of power is something that's incredibly usual there. It really is extraordinary. And I think absolutely the correct instinct to say, I have to show, and I will go back to the office and I will do those things. But I mean, that's truly amazing. You must have been pretty freaked out, but that is some real leadership there.
You know, thank you. And I think that going back to you know, what you were saying, Lisa, this comment about the need to be brave. I mean, to I think take chances, to push oneself. I mean, I think that you know, that has been something I've wrestled with myself in my career. Sometimes I'm ready to hold back. But I think I have been, you know, I've gained confidence because I have been in some of these challenging assignments. Pakistan was challenging, but it was also rewarding, and people gave me opportunities, and I took the opportunities that were in front of me. And you know, there were definitely challenges over the roles of women. There was no doubt about it. But I also found that when I proved myself, when I showed that I was knowledgeable, competent, that I was a good decision maker. I mean, my Pakistani colleagues and friends, you know, they saw that. And I think that's what women need to understand, that, you know, when you have those qualities, people will see them and they will respond to them and give you that chance to make the most of your opportunities.
Yeah, I do think like seeing the example of someone behaving in a way that maybe you didn't think was possible or it didn't occur to you, like seeing someone, even just sort of seeing that you know, there is a woman who is the ambassador to the Russian Federation right now for the United States. That's just a wonderful thing for young women to see. And I think can you speak a little bit to, you know, making a film about Rosie the Riveters, you know, something that happened so many years ago? What is it that you hope women who see it now will take away from a film like that?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is that we often look over women's experiences when they're not framed in male ways. You know, like and I think that there's a whole sea of women in the past who have been fighting for their own identities, fighting for their own independence, fighting to belong to society in ways that were not preordained by, you know, by prejudice and by economics, you know, economical problems that befall women because they didn't have the ability to earn their own money. And I would like people to look deeper into the women around them, you know, to bring it back to sort of equity and equality. In order for there to be true equity, you have to be willing to see someone's story. You have to be willing to understand where they come from and absorb that into the way that you frame your world. Not just ask everyone to be on board with the one path that is saying like everyone is X, Y, or Z. And I think that that's what I hope people walk away from. And I also hope people walk away from it talking to their grandparents and their elders and understanding how much they have to give us. They have a path. They've already gone down the road once. So if we don't listen to them, we're going to have to go down the road again. And then if no one listens to us, our children are going to go down that road. So just about generational knowledge and empowerment that you get when you are willing to really listen and hear from the people who have lived before you. And also for young women, I want little boys to watch this film and not think about it as a women's film. You know, this is history. This isn't just a sidebar to history. And I think that's the part that was interesting is like in America, when people think about women in the Second World War, they think about that poster, right? That we can do it poster, and you're holding down the home front. And it's such a simplification of what the experiences actually were for all of those women.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know if that exactly answers your question.
No, that's great. Yeah, no, and you know, thinking about that poster, obviously, you also think about the posters in the Soviet Union at the time, where it was, you know, a lot of women out there, you know, with the doing the work and fighting the fight, and it was those similarities are really just, if you put those posters side by side, it's absolutely just so similar.
And it was women in a lot of countries. There was a huge sort of rosy movement in this in England, in the UK, everywhere, because I love the line that Mildred says at the end, which is like the world was on its knees. Mm-hmm. The war had affected everyone, you know, to the point where it took everyone to win the war. Mm-hmm. And women were a huge part of that, and they're sort of written out as sort of a sidebar, but they were an enormous part of the winning of the war. And they also did, you know, the vast majority of the mourning. You know, a lot of the women we interviewed lost husbands or brothers, or, you know, it affected the women in a huge way, not only in allowing them to move forward, but also in disrupting, like you were saying, the path they thought their life was going to take, right? This was a moment where your life is sort of in front of you and things shift. And as you said so well, Ambassador Tracy, you have to go with the moment, you know, you have to go with where you are and steer down whatever road you're on. So.
Yeah. We're going to switch it up a little bit and switch over to the audience questions. We've gotten some good questions that have come in. I'm just going to start from the start here. First question is, Anne, what did you hope audiences would take away? Ooh, I guess I stole that question. And what were your personal takeaways when you saw it, or I guess when you finished the film? What were your personal takeaways?
For me, it was very personal. As a filmmaker, I am a storyteller, and as a documentary filmmaker, I think that all we really possess as people is our story. Everything else can get taken away from you. But there's a tremendous privilege in telling someone else's story. And I felt so honored. My filmmaking partner, Kirsten Kelly, and I talked often about how it was such a privilege to tell these women's stories. And that we really did, it felt when we were interviewing the women like they were slipping through our fingers because the women were dying. But I felt very privileged to tell the stories. And that we have to keep telling the stories. Yes. You know, it's how we learn how to be better people is through the stories. So
that's so true. Our stories are what we have. And I think also the point that you have made earlier about learning from and valuing the experiences of the older people in our society. I don't think that is something the United States does particularly well. I think there are other cultures who do it much better than we do. And I think it's a real shame, and it is a loss. And I think it's great that you've made this film. I have a question for the ambassador. What Russian or Soviet woman do you consider the most outstanding?
You know, I think about figures like one that's I think fairly contemporary and accessible is Galina Vishnevskaya, a very well-known opera star who you know, was a figure in her own right, but she you know, she was married to also a world famous cellist Miroslav Rostropovich. And together, they were very important voices in supporting Soviet dissidents, giving them shelter at a risk to their own careers. But, she was somebody who, even with a very famous husband, she managed to shine in her own right, both in terms of her professional work, but in what she was doing in terms of some very important work in supporting voices that needed to be heard and speaking truth to power. And I mean, there are others, but for me, she's somebody who's an inspiration.
That's great. I would vote for Anna Akhmatova.
I also thought about Anna Akhmatova. There are many.
There are so many. Yeah. Yelena Bonner, Anna Akhmatova. There's so many women who have been incredible examples in Russian and Soviet times. Yeah. The next we have a comment. There was a book called Fly Girls that discussed the women that flew planes during the war. It's good to see these women's stories coming out. So thank you, Anne. And I see you nodding at Fly Girls. Yeah.
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 I mean, there were women played all kinds of roles during the war, and we don't know about them. So all of the ones that we know about, I'm super excited about.
Yeah. Question 4: is there a way to reach full equality between men and women?
I don't know if there's a way to reach full equality. I hope there's a way to reach full equity. To bring it back to the equity equality question. I don't know. I mean, I was when I was a young girl, my father lived overseas a lot, and so I grew up and I went to an all-girls school. And for me, growing up, I didn't really understand the power dynamics between men and women culturally. Like, I grew up surrounded by women. I went to school with women. I was encouraged to be. I didn't think there was anything I couldn't do. And then I hit the workplace in my 20s, and it was a really big shocker that men really did rule the power structures in the world, and that I had to be better and smarter and tougher than men to be able to sort of get by. And so what I ended up doing was I was just like, well, I'm going to go do my own thing. And I started my own businesses, and I became, I entered the workforce that way. But it was a real shock. And I think the first thing is in the children and in young people to not, I feel like very often the thing we always say to little girls is, you're so pretty. And then we talk to boys about being smart and strong and funny. But for little girls, we're still struggling to give them the same kind of identity in themselves. And I think that that's a big piece of it, because we have to take our place. It's not going to be given to us. I mean, historically, no one ever gives out of the goodness of their heart equality to people who don't have it. You have to kind of stand like, I'm here.
I can't remember who said it, but yeah, nobody ever gives up power voluntarily.
No,
it's true. Yeah. And the other great saying of, for women, you have to be twice as good to get half as far. And it's really true. Yeah.
But I do hope we're doing better. I think we're doing better.
Yeah. We have a couple of comments, and the second one is very exciting to me. The first one is very insightful observations and facts about the social role of women in modern American culture. Thank you. And then the second one, the comment is, Ambassador Tracy, I had the honor of meeting you in Yerevan last year at your farewell reception at the embassy. And Ms. Dickey, Bears in the Streets inspired me to move to St. Petersburg in 2022. Thank you both for being so inspirational to me in my life. So this excites me because I didn't mention this at the beginning, but now look, I'm going to show you guys. This is my book about Russia, 3 trips across Russia over a 20-year period. And I lived in St. Petersburg for several years, and it's just such a spectacular city. And whoever made this comment, you just have made my day. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Same.
Yeah. Question, you have a lot of experience in foreign service. This is obviously for the ambassador. How can you compare your experiences of working in different countries?
I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is to go in with a sense of curiosity, of being ready to listen, to hear stories, to learn. And what I have been so fortunate across my career is that everywhere I've served, and I include Russia and in this comment, is that I've been very, very fortunate to meet people and meet Russians who have been willing to share their stories about their lives, about, and some of these are just everyday, ordinary Russians, just struggles, things that they went through, men and women, but in a number of cases, it was the stories of women who had struggles, a single mom who was a doctor and trying to raise a son, and was, but under a lot of demand as a doctor, and trying to juggle all of that. And then when the Soviet Union broke up, trying to start over again in many respects. And so I think what Anne has been saying about the importance of capturing these stories, and as I said, of listening and learning, that is what has helped me everywhere I've been, I think, to understand better, and then I hope, to be succeeding in the role that I'm playing as a diplomat.
There's another question I'm going to ask, and it's also about Russia. So this is also for the ambassador. We just got this one in. In Russia, making a career for a woman means marrying your boss or his partner or his brother, etc. Do the same rules exist in the USA?
I don't think so. And I'm sorry to hear that comment. I mean, everyone has their own experience and what they see as their sense of what their knowledge is about the world around them. But I will speak to what at least I have seen in my experience in the United States, in my profession, and it is a merit-based profession. I think that, do I want to say, that nothing ever happens in terms of who you know versus what you know. I think there's probably always some aspect of that everywhere, but it has been something that's been very encouraging to me in terms of seeing the opportunities for myself and for women around me. But I think, as again, I'm just speaking about my experience and in my institution, and I think that there are certainly stories of where women continue to struggle. I think this is going back to this earlier part of our conversation about, will men and women ever reach full equality? I think it's an ongoing struggle. And we make progress, but we continue to see where we need to improve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here's a question I'll throw to Anne. What is important for a woman to succeed, luck or education? In your opinion, how should successful women spend what they earn?
Well, I think that it's hard to come up with a specific answer. There's a piece of me that says that education opens doors, but I have almost no formal education. I left home when I was young, and I never went to college, and so I have a very different path. I think the most important thing is to follow the voice inside you, trust the voice inside you, and make that voice as smart as that voice can be, right? So if you're going to say, I'm interested in whatever you're interested in, anything from foreign service to being an artist to being in business, like make the voice inside you that wants that, give that voice all the power you can, give it all the information you can, give it all the friends you can. And in terms of spending money, you know, it's interesting. I think that that's the amazing thing when you earn your own money, is it's yours to make your choices with. And just make, you know, and that's the thing, is like, make the choices that get you to the place you want to go. And, you know, whatever choice that is. I always say I live a very rich life. I don't have a lot of money because I'm an independent filmmaker. You know, I don't make very much money at all, but I live this wonderful life where I get to talk to people around the world about their stories and about my work. And I have a wonderful, I really enjoy my life. And I wish that women understood that your life belongs to you. It doesn't belong to your husband or your father or anyone else. It belongs to you, and you can make it what you want it to be. And that's where we're going to get like true equality, right? Like,
right. But that goes back to the question, excuse me, of courage, doesn't it?
yeah.
It's believing that you can do that. It's stepping out, because there's a certain probably security in sort of feeling like, well, historically, it's just been that, you know, I'll get married and I'll get taken care of and I won't have to worry about supporting myself or that, you know, any of those types of things. And it does take some courage to say, no, I am going to be the author of my own destiny and I am going to be responsible for myself. But the rewards of that are obviously also quite large if you can do that. Here's a question for both of you. You both work in industries that have been historically dominated by men. I would argue that most industries have been historically dominated by men also. But what motivated you to choose your path? What changes related to the role of women have you witnessed over the years in your industries?
That's a big question.
These are big questions. These are good questions.
Yeah.
No softballs, ladies. No softballs.
You know, I think I mentioned this earlier. I'll just reinforce it. You know, I came into the Foreign Service at a time when women were benefiting from the efforts of women a generation or two earlier. Women who, even after the requirement for resignation was lifted, it was still not easy for women to be assigned to positions that were seen as career enhancing, that put an officer on a path for promotion. And so there were, you know, there were legal battles, battles inside the department over rules and how we made assignments, that by the time I got there, it was a benefit to me, and I felt it. I felt it in terms of the support that I had from supervisors. And then, you know, because I was seeing women leaders above me, you know, I could imagine I was seeing people who looked like me, who had an experience that I felt I could relate to. And, you know, the change that I see because of that is that when I came in, I would say there were a handful of women, career women in senior leadership positions in the department. Now they're everywhere. And it is a big and noticeable change to me almost 30 years later.
Let's go. Go ahead, Anne.
No, I was just going to say that I don't see as clearly as the ambassador does the sort of changes in the industries that I'm connected to. You know, there tend to be more women in documentary filmmaking than in general filmmaking because there's less. I mean, I think it's largely because there's less money in it, and the men aren't as interested in this work. I also think women are different kind of storytellers. We listen differently. And with documentary, I think it's about the listening. But I will say that I hope that there will come a time when we don't have to divide ourselves in this way when we talk professionally. Like, I became a filmmaker because I loved telling stories and I love telling stories with film. I didn't think about, is it a male dominated field or not? Because as you say, Lisa, most fields are male dominated. But I hope that there's a time when we don't have to ask that question, where, you know, you can follow your interest and you don't have to bend yourself around what gender is usually in charge, you know?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Here's a sort of fun one. Are there any other female figures who played an important yet not properly recognized role in history who you would like to see at the center of a film or a book?
Oh, wow.
Oh.
I feel like there's dozens of them. Like my brain is not fixing on one.
Mm-hmm.
Let me jump in with just, and hopefully I won't get into trouble for calling out a particular newspaper, but because others may be doing this, but the New York Times has been running a series of where they go back and actually run an obituary of someone who they felt was not properly recognized. And a number of these have been focused on women, and I have really enjoyed them. I mean, they're catching a number of people, but they really, I think, have recognized women having gone unnoticed or not properly recognized at the times of their death for contributions they had made. And I think that's a great idea. And it's probably the source of future stories.
Yeah. Along those lines, Anne, I'd like to ask you, what's next for you? What are you working on next?
I am about to release a film that I've been working on for about 6 years, also with Kirsten Kelly, who is my co-director on the animated film, called This Is Where I Learned Not to Sleep. And it's a film about household violence and surviving household violence, and particularly how that intersects with law enforcement. It's about a former Nashville SWAT officer who kind of dedicated his life to changing the way American law enforcement responds to domestic violence, because he was a little boy in a house where they were as afraid of the police as they were of their stepfather. And so that film is coming out in this year, and I'm working on a wonderful archival project. There was an American filmmaker who was very important in the 70s, 80s, and 90s called William Greaves. He was an African-American filmmaker who started Black Journal on PBS. And I was working with his widow until she passed very recently, but I'm working with the family on a preservation project for this trove of it's material that was unfinished that he shot in Harlem in the 1970s. And it's about many things, but it's about the writers and the thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance. So that's a privilege to work on that piece. So that's what's next for me.
That's great. And then I guess the last question, we just have a couple minutes left, would be, do you have any parting words or any thoughts about pushing forward into the future for women who are looking to address these issues of equity and equality? Any sort of parting thoughts?
I think the thing that's come up, that's been said a few times, is just courage. Just courage. I was thinking about when the ambassador was talking about her heroism award, and thinking about how it's in those moments where we feel the most afraid sometimes that we grow the most. The things that challenge us the most are the places where if we push through them, we become different people. So I would just say courage.
Yeah, that's great. Ambassador, anything?
I think this goes to really one of the points that I took away from Anne's film, and it was the Black Rosie who talked about this encounter that she had at the reunion when there was someone there who was not expecting to see a Black Rosie, didn't realize it, didn't think that in those terms, that Rosie wasn't just limited to one race. And, I think it is the importance of again, listening to stories, of not making assumptions just on what you see at the surface, but being ready to go deeper and listen. And that is what helps, I think, us do better at these questions of equity, because it is understanding sometimes the circumstances that people bring into the workplace or into a relationship that is not always visible there on the surface, but you have to listen and be ready to learn. And if you do that, I think it will, it gives you, I think, a greater sense. Anybody who is doing that, I think, is just in so much a better position, not just in whatever job they have or in their workplace, but I think in setting a good example for others.
It's great. Perfect. I want to thank both of you. Thank you, Ambassador Tracy. Thank you, Anne DeMare. I also want to thank the Forum for Cultural Engagement and the American Center in Moscow. And I would like to thank everybody who tuned in and sent great questions. And I hope that you've been able to take away something useful and valuable. And yeah, everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.